Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche, a name that would later resonate through the realms of philosophy, was born on October 15, 1844, in the tiny village of Raaken, near Lutzen, in what was then the Kingdom of Prussia. Raaken itself was a small, rural community with a population of just around 300, a setting that greatly influenced his early years. His birth coincided with the birthday of King Friedrich Wilhelm IV of Prussia, after whom he was named, a symbolic connection to Prussian royalty, which would subtly shape aspects of his upbringing. Friedrich's father, Ludwig Nietzsche, was a 31-year-old Lutheran pastor serving at the local church in Raaken. Ludwig had received his theological education at the renowned University of Halle, and for 7 years had worked as a private tutor to the daughters of Duke Joseph of Saxe-Altenburg, a minor prince and a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars. This close association with the royal family contributed to Ludwig's standing in society, and the Nietzsche family held conservative views, loyal to the Prussian monarchy. In 1842, after taking up his post in Raaken, Ludwig met 17-year-old Franziska Ehler. They were married the following October, on Ludwig's 30th birthday. Franziska, the daughter of the pastor from the nearby parish of Pobels, was just 19 when she gave birth to their first son, Friedrich. The family expanded with the birth of their daughter, Elizabeth, in 1846 and their second son, Ludwig Joseph, in 1848. Friedrich's early life was shaped by his father's influence. Ludwig was highly respected in the community and maintained strong religious convictions, which he hoped to pass on to his children. Little Friedrich, or Fritz as he was affectionately called, spent his early days surrounded by books in his father's study, enjoying the intellectual environment of their scholarly household. This tranquil existence in rural Raaken seemed idyllic for the young boy. However, Friedrich's later philosophical break from Christianity, leading to his famous declaration that God is dead, would stand in stark contrast to the devout Lutheranism of his upbringing. In 1848, Europe was shaken by revolutionary fervor as uprisings spread across the continent, demanding political change. The Nietzsche family, staunchly conservative and loyal to the Prussian monarchy, was horrified when King Friedrich Wilhelm IV was forced to make concessions to revolutionary forces. Yet these external political events were soon overshadowed by personal tragedy. Shortly after the revolutions, Friedrich's father began suffering from a series of unexplained seizures. Despite the best efforts of doctors, Ludwig passed away in July 1849, a devastating blow for the family. Then, just 6 months later, Friedrich's younger brother, Ludwig Joseph, died shortly before his second birthday. With their world upended, the Nietzsche family relocated to the town of Naumburg to live with Friedrich's paternal grandmother, Erdmith, and his 2 aunts. At just 5 years old, Friedrich found it difficult to adapt to urban life after the rural tranquility of Raaken. The change of environment proved challenging for the young boy, whose scholarly and introverted nature was better suited to quiet reflection. In 1851, Friedrich began receiving lessons from a priest in training named Weber, marking the beginning of his formal education. Around this time, he developed close friendships with Wilhelm Pinder, whose family was one of the wealthiest and most influential in Naumburg, and Pinder's cousin, Gustav Krug, the son of a prominent local official and an accomplished musician. These early friendships introduced Friedrich to broader cultural and social circles, helping him adjust to his new life in Naumburg. His bond with his sister, Elizabeth, also remained strong during this period, though their views would later diverge drastically, with Elizabeth embracing nationalist ideologies that clashed with Friedrich's more critical perspectives. By October 1854, Friedrich, now 10 years old and known affectionately as Fritz, entered a new stage in his education when he, along with his friends, was admitted to the prestigious Cathedral High School in Naumburg. It was a significant milestone, marking his early academic promise. Just 2 years later, in 1856, the Nietzsche family moved into a larger house, which allowed Friedrich greater opportunities to cultivate his artistic inclinations. A new piano was installed in their home, and Fritz began receiving lessons from a local choirmaster, quickly proving to be a gifted musician. This talent for music would stay with him throughout his life, influencing not only his philosophical thought, but also his deep later connection to composers like Richard Wagner. However, the bliss of youthful creativity did not last uninterrupted. In October 1857, just after his 13th birthday, Friedrich began suffering from severe headaches, a condition that would plague him throughout his life. His mother, concerned for his health, decided to withdraw him from school to allow time for recovery. These early migraines were a precursor to the chronic health issues that would follow Nietzsche in his later years and contribute significantly to his withdrawal from public life. During this period of recuperation, Nietzsche's intellectual development continued at home. By early 1858, when he returned to school, Friedrich had already penned 2 short plays, demonstrating an early knack for storytelling and creative writing. His literary passion continued to blossom that same year during a visit to his maternal relatives in Pobels. There, inspired by memories of his childhood, Nietzsche composed a short autobiographical account of his life, reflecting on his early experiences and the deeply influential presence of his father. He also wrote about the music he had heard in his father's church, favoring the classical styles of Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven, which he felt elevated the soul and directed human thoughts toward higher ideals. Interestingly, at just 13 years old, Nietzsche was already critical of the emerging Romantic composers like Franz Liszt and Hector Berlioz, whom he felt were more concerned with creating music for public spectacle or mere enjoyment, rather than pursuing deeper cultural or spiritual value. He would later challenge many of his own early opinions, but this period showcases Nietzsche's early engagement with the cultural and aesthetic critiques that would shape his career as a philosopher and critic. In September 1858, shortly after his return to Naumburg, Nietzsche's academic achievements earned him a scholarship to the esteemed Formative boarding school, west of his hometown. Formative was well known for its rigorous curriculum, steeped in the classical traditions of Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, and its focus on preparing students for intellectual leadership. The intense school schedule demanded 10 hours of study each day, but Nietzsche adapted quickly to this challenging environment. The school's proximity to Naumburg allowed him to visit his family regularly, which provided him some comfort. Yet, he missed the daily companionship of his close friends, Wilhelm Pinder and Gustav Krug, who had remained behind in Naumburg to continue their studies. That same year, Friedrich experienced a notable summer break in July 1859 when he visited the university town of Jena. Jena, a hotbed of intellectual activity, left a lasting impression on the young scholar. Upon his return to Pforta in August, Nietzsche topped his class in the final exams. However, his academic successes were shadowed by personal loss. His maternal grandfather, David Ehler, passed away at the age of 72, forcing Nietzsche's relatives to move away from Pobels, cutting a sentimental tie to his maternal roots. In the summer of 1860, Friedrich's intellectual and social world expanded once more. Along with his old friends Wilhelm Pinder and Gustav Krug, Nietzsche founded a 3-man literary society they called Germania. The trio met regularly to discuss literature, music, and their respective creative works. Nietzsche's love for music and literature intertwined during this period, and he began working on a Christmas oratorio, a form of sacred music similar to an opera but with religious themes, reflecting his continued interest in both classical and spiritual traditions. In November 1860, Nietzsche received a letter from Krug praising the then unperformed opera Tristan und Isolde by Richard Wagner. This epic 5-hour work, based on Arthurian legend, had yet to be performed but was already generating significant buzz in the music world. Wagner's passionate, dramatic style would later have a profound influence on Nietzsche, though at the time, The young philosopher in the making didn't yet share his friend's enthusiasm for Wagner's work. During this period, Nietzsche's evolving musical tastes became evident. Although he had previously dismissed the music of Liszt as indulgent and decadent, his views began to shift. He started to appreciate Liszt's compositions, particularly drawn to the emotional depth and innovation of his music. Additionally, Nietzsche developed an interest in Slavic and Hungarian folklore, broadening his cultural horizons and demonstrating an openness to different artistic influences that would later manifest in his philosophical ideas. Despite these intellectual and artistic pursuits, Nietzsche's recurring migraines continued to disrupt his work. His health would remain a persistent issue, challenging his ability to sustain long periods of study and creativity throughout his life. Nonetheless, his formative years at Forda laid the groundwork for his future brilliance as both a philosopher and a cultural critic. The year 1861 marked a profound transformation in Nietzsche's intellectual life, particularly in how he approached history and literature. As part of his school assignments, Nietzsche wrote an essay defending the works of the German poet and philosopher Friedrich Hölderlin. Hölderlin had presented a sharp contrast between the barbarism of contemporary Germany and the grand achievements of classical antiquity, a viewpoint that intrigued Nietzsche. Hölderlin's support for the French Revolution further drew Nietzsche's attention, as it aligned with his growing curiosity about radical change and upheaval. Nietzsche's early defense of Hölderlin was an indication of his willingness to explore bold, controversial ideas, a hallmark of his later philosophical work. Around the same time, Nietzsche was deeply inspired by the English Romantic poet Lord Byron. One of Byron's works, Manfred, a play featuring a brooding, superhuman hero who seeks knowledge and power beyond human limitations, captivated Nietzsche. Manfred's defiant attitude toward fate and the human condition struck a chord with the young philosopher. This early admiration for Byron's romantic heroes, who often challenged societal norms and defied conventional morality, would later resonate in Nietzsche's own ideas about the Übermensch or Overman, a central figure in his philosophical thought. However, Nietzsche's writings soon sparked controversy. One of his essays from this period expressed support for Napoleon III, the French emperor who was the nephew of the famous Napoleon Bonaparte. This essay, which defended a figure responsible for devastating parts of Germany just half a century earlier, drew sharp criticism from his friends. But instead of being deterred, Nietzsche's willingness to engage with contentious figures and ideas only grew. This was an early sign of the bold and often provocative nature of his intellectual work, traits that would come to define his later career as a philosopher who frequently challenged the moral, political, and cultural assumptions of his time. In his developing worldview, Nietzsche's creativity surged, driven by a burgeoning sense of rebellion against societal norms. He wrote an essay titled Fate and History, in which he reached a critical realization that had a lasting influence on his thought. The individual, who is theoretically free, is actually bound by a host of customs, traditions, and social norms ingrained from childhood. Nietzsche called this omnipresent influence fate. He believed that to achieve true freedom, one had to continuously struggle against these invisible constraints. This idea became a defining element in Nietzsche's philosophy, particularly as he sought to understand what it means to live authentically and autonomously in a world shaped by conventions. This realization also marked a turning point in his personal life, particularly in his relationship with Christianity. Nietzsche began to reject the Christian moral framework he had grown up with, recognizing it as part of the fate he wanted to overcome. This rejection of Christian morality was not just a personal rebellion, but also the beginning of Nietzsche's lifelong quest to critique and dismantle the ethical and religious structures that, in his view, limited human potential. His eventual declaration that God is dead stems from these formative years of wrestling with faith and freedom. Despite his deepening philosophical inquiries and frequent health struggles, especially the persistent headaches, Nietzsche continued to perform well academically at Forda. By the autumn of 1862, his intellectual journey took another turn when he finally embraced the music of Richard Wagner. After the Germania Society, of which he was a member, acquired a copy of the score for Wagner's Tristan und Isolde, Nietzsche and his friend Gustav Krug eagerly sat at the piano to work their way through the challenging opera. Wagner's passionate, dramatic compositions had a profound effect on Nietzsche, whose initial reluctance toward the composer melted away. So impressed was he that he took the score with him to Forda, much to the annoyance of Krug, who had been the one to suggest purchasing it in the first place. In his personal life, Nietzsche's rebellious streak continued to grow. In his effort to tear down the traditional rules surrounding him, he began engaging in acts of defiance, such as joining his classmates in smoking and drinking. However, his carefree attitude soon caught up with him. In the spring of 1863, while returning from a night of drunken revelry, Nietzsche was caught by one of his teachers. The incident led to him being held back a semester, a setback that he would later reflect on with mixed emotions. His growing obsession with literature and music had also started to affect his academic performance, and his grades began to suffer as a result. By the late summer of 1864, Nietzsche barely managed to pass his final exams. It was a sharp contrast to the intellectual promise he had shown just a few years earlier. While his close friends Wilhelm Pinder and Gustav Krug went on to study at the University of Heidelberg, Nietzsche made the surprising decision to enroll in theology at the University of Bonn. This decision puzzled many, given his increasing doubts about religion, but it seemed to reflect Nietzsche's continued grappling with his Christian upbringing and a desire to explore the theological dimensions of his philosophical inquiries. Nietzsche arrived at Bonn in October 1864, accompanied by his Forda classmate Paul Deussen, who would later achieve fame as a scholar of Sanskrit. At Bonn, Nietzsche attended lectures by two renowned philologists, Otto John and Friedrich Nietzsche, both of whom would play significant roles in shaping his intellectual future. While his initial path may have seemed contradictory, it set the stage for the critical philosophical developments that would define Nietzsche's later work, as he continued to wrestle with questions of history, fate, freedom, and morality. In the 19th century, philology stood at the forefront of European academic inquiry, despite being considered a relatively obscure field today. At its core, philology blends literary criticism with the analysis of ancient texts and languages, all while maintaining a historical lens. It's important to understand this context, as Nietzsche was initially seen by his contemporaries as a philologist rather than the groundbreaking philosopher he is remembered as today. Much of his early academic work fits squarely into the domain of philology, with Nietzsche applying meticulous methods to dissect the meaning of ancient texts. During the Easter holidays of 1865, when Nietzsche returned to his family home in Naumburg, he shocked his mother by declaring that he no longer intended to become a priest, a path he had once seriously considered. His growing fascination with philology had opened his eyes to how myths are constructed and perpetuated over time. Nietzsche began to realize that the historical figure of Jesus of Nazareth had been transformed into a divine character by early Christians, a process he saw as typical of how religious myths evolve. Armed with a copy of David Strauss's Life of Jesus, first published in 1835, Nietzsche used the book to reinforce his arguments. Strauss, a controversial theologian, had attributed the Gospels not to eyewitnesses, but to the early Christian communities, who had written them decades after Jesus' death. Nietzsche, deeply influenced by this line of thought, was firm in his stance and resisted all of his family's attempts to steer him back to theology. Upon returning to Bonn, Nietzsche took the formal step of transferring to the Faculty of Philology, a move that signaled the beginning of a more focused academic career in this emerging field. However, It wasn't long before Nietzsche became dissatisfied with life in Bonn. The city and the university failed to inspire him, and with financial concerns on the rise, he decided to transfer to the University of Leipzig in Saxony, his native region. There was another factor behind this decision. His mentor, Friedrich Nietzsche, a prominent philologist who had recently been appointed at Leipzig. Nietzsche admired Ritschl's work, and his move to Leipzig marked a significant turning point in his intellectual journey. It was during Nietzsche's early months in Leipzig, in October 1865, that he encountered the work of a philosopher who would profoundly shape his thinking, Arthur Schopenhauer. Nietzsche stumbled upon Schopenhauer's seminal book, The World as Will and Representation, and was immediately captivated. Schopenhauer's philosophy built upon the ideas of his predecessor, Immanuel Kant, but ventured into a more pessimistic view of existence. He argued that the empirical world we experience is merely a representation formed by our senses, but behind this veil lies a more primal, unknowable force he called the will. This force, according to Schopenhauer, drives all living beings and governs their actions and desires. Schopenhauer's concept of the will, which encompasses a relentless pursuit of desires, was revolutionary for Nietzsche. While humans had achieved dominance over nature through intellect and reason, Schopenhauer saw this as a hollow victory. In his view, the human will was destined to perpetually chase after desires, only to find itself trapped in a cycle of fleeting satisfaction followed by boredom. For Schopenhauer, the relentless pursuit of desire was the root cause of suffering in human life. This bleak view of the human condition resonated with Nietzsche, whose own experiences and growing disillusionment with traditional moral and religious structures made Schopenhauer's philosophy seem like a revelation. Schopenhauer offered a way to confront the harsh realities of life by appreciating the beauty found in nature and the sublime experiences of art. In these aesthetic experiences, Schopenhauer believed one could briefly escape the suffering inherent in existence. Nietzsche, who was already deeply drawn to art and music, found a kinship in this view, and Schopenhauer's work would leave a lasting imprint on his philosophical development. In early 1866, Nietzsche's intellectual endeavors took a significant leap forward when he founded a philological club. This group provided a platform for him to present his ideas and engage with peers in a more structured academic environment. One of the papers he presented at the club caught the attention of his mentor, Professor Ritschl, who offered to support Nietzsche in publishing his work. This endorsement was a crucial moment for Nietzsche, whose academic career was just beginning to take shape. Around this time, the political landscape in Saxony was also undergoing dramatic changes. The region found itself embroiled in a conflict between Prussia, the dominant power in northern Germany, and the Austrian Habsburg Empire, which held sway over much of southern Central Europe. In July of that year, Prussia secured a decisive victory at the Battle of Königgrätz, which shifted the balance of power in the region. Saxony, where Nietzsche was living, effectively became a Prussian protectorate after the battle, with Prussian influence spreading rapidly. Despite his academic success, Nietzsche was swept up in the wave of German nationalism and, in September 1867, enlisted in an artillery regiment. However, his military career was short-lived. In March 1868, Nietzsche was seriously injured in a fall from his horse, suffering physical damage that would continue to haunt him throughout his life. Though the injury was debilitating, it provided Nietzsche with time to refocus on his scholarly work during his recovery. Prior to his enlistment, Nietzsche had written an acclaimed essay on Diogenes Laertius, a Greek historian and biographer of ancient philosophers who lived during the 3rd century AD. Laertius remains one of our most important sources for the lives and teachings of classical philosophers, including figures like Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism. Nietzsche's essay on Laertius won him a prize and was later published in a prestigious journal edited by Ritschl, further cementing his reputation as a rising star in the academic world. Over the course of 1868, two more of Nietzsche's essays were accepted for publication in the same journal, marking a period of rapid intellectual development. By the age of just 24, Nietzsche was well on his way to academic stardom. In October 1868, following his return to Leipzig after his military service, Nietzsche received an invitation that would prove to be a defining moment in his personal and intellectual life. On November 8th, through an introduction by a friend, Nietzsche was invited to a private gathering where he would meet one of his idols, the legendary composer Richard Wagner. Wagner, whose operas were revolutionary in their blending of music, mythology, and drama, performed extracts from his work for the small group of attendees, much to Nietzsche's delight. After the performance, Nietzsche and Wagner engaged in conversation about philosophy, a subject dear to both of them. To Nietzsche's amazement, Wagner shared his admiration for Schopenhauer, the very philosopher who had so profoundly influenced Nietzsche's worldview. This mutual appreciation for Schopenhauer's ideas created an instant bond between the two men, and Wagner invited Nietzsche to visit him at his home in Lucerne, Switzerland, to continue their philosophical discussions. As fate would have it, shortly after meeting Wagner, Nietzsche received an extraordinary offer that would change the course of his career. The University of Basel in Switzerland invited him to take up a professorship in classical philology, despite the fact that Nietzsche had not yet completed his university degree. The position came with a generous salary of 3,000 Swiss francs a year, which was an impressive sum for a young scholar. Convinced by Nietzsche's early publications and his intellectual promise, the university hired him without hesitation, and in March 1869, Nietzsche left for Switzerland to begin his new role as a professor. Although he found it challenging to be away from his friends and family in Germany, Nietzsche made frequent trips to Wagner's villa at Tribschen, located on the idyllic shores of Lake Lucerne. There, he became an integral part of Wagner's inner circle, forging a close relationship with Wagner's mistress and future wife, Cosima von Bülow. Cosima, the daughter of the famed composer Franz Liszt, was a deeply influential figure in her own right, and Nietzsche would later praise her as the embodiment of womanhood. Nietzsche's time spent with Wagner and Cosima provided him with both personal fulfillment and intellectual stimulation. At the time, Wagner was hard at work on Siegfried, the third opera in his monumental Ring cycle, a series based on ancient Germanic mythology. Wagner appreciated Nietzsche's profound interest in his work, and the two men's friendship flourished during this period. After spending a memorable Christmas with the Wagner family, Nietzsche returned to Basel in early 1870, where he delivered two highly provocative lectures. In these talks, Nietzsche challenged conventional views of Socrates, one of the most revered figures in Western philosophy. He argued that Socrates played a significant role in the decline of Greek culture, which had once reached unparalleled heights in epic poetry and tragedy. Nietzsche believed that classical Greek culture was at its zenith during the 6th and early 5th centuries BC, a time when great poets and tragedians like Homer and Aeschylus dominated the cultural landscape. However, in Nietzsche's view, figures like Socrates, who emerged in the late 5th century BC, brought about a cultural decline through their rationalism and simplistic approach to philosophy, which Nietzsche believed lacked the emotional and existential depth found in earlier Greek thought. These controversial ideas would later become a cornerstone of Nietzsche's broader philosophical critique of Western culture. He was convinced that the rationalism and moralism of Socratic thought marked a shift away from the life-affirming values of earlier Greek art and philosophy toward a more sterile intellectualism. Nietzsche's critiques of Socrates would later be expanded in his famous work The Birth of Tragedy, published in 1872. In April 1870, Nietzsche received the news that his position at the University of Basel had been made permanent, which should have been a moment of celebration for him. However, his joy was quickly tempered by the realization that his teaching duties would now consume 20 hours a week, an exhausting schedule that left little time for his personal research and philosophical writings. Around the same time, Wagner also dealt Nietzsche a personal blow. The composer informed his close friends that he planned to leave Tribschen, his picturesque villa on the shores of Lake Lucerne, and move to Bayreuth in Bavaria. There, under the patronage of King Ludwig II, Wagner would build his own opera house, specifically designed to stage his monumental Ring cycle. This news devastated Nietzsche, who had become deeply attached to Wagner and his inner circle. In a letter to Cosima, Nietzsche hinted that he might leave his academic post in Basel within a year or two to follow Wagner to Bayreuth. Meanwhile, world events soon disrupted Nietzsche's life even further. In July 1870, France's Emperor Napoleon III declared war on Prussia, igniting the Franco-Prussian War. The conflict quickly engulfed much of Western Europe. That summer, Nietzsche spent time with the Wagners once again, but as soon as the university allowed him a leave of absence, he volunteered as a medical orderly. By August, Nietzsche had made his way to the front lines in eastern France, arriving at the headquarters of the Prussian Southern Army in Nancy, located in the region of Lorraine. It was here that Nietzsche witnessed the decisive Prussian victory at the Battle of Sedan on September 2, 1870, a battle that effectively crushed French resistance and paved the way for the unification of Germany under Prussian dominance. Although the war ended in January 1871 with the establishment of the German Empire, orchestrated by Prussia's Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, Nietzsche's experience during the conflict had a profound impact on him. In the early stages of the war, he, like many Germans, was caught up in the patriotic fervor of the Prussian victories. However, after contracting both diphtheria and dysentery while serving as a medical orderly, Nietzsche's enthusiasm for the war quickly soured. His already fragile health was severely impacted, and he became increasingly disillusioned with Prussian militarism and nationalism. By the war's end, Nietzsche had developed a far more critical view of Prussian aggression and the political direction of the newly unified German Empire. As Nietzsche convalesced during the winter of 1870, his thoughts began to shift. He grew increasingly frustrated with his academic focus on philology, the study of ancient texts and languages, and yearned to devote more time to philosophy. This period marked a turning point in his intellectual journey. Nietzsche began to lay the groundwork for his transition away from philology and toward the broader philosophical questions that would define his later work. Nevertheless, his personal life remained a source of disappointment and emotional strain. Despite the joy of spending Christmas with the Wagners, where he witnessed Wagner perform Siegfried Idol as a surprise birthday gift for Cosima, Nietzsche felt increasingly isolated. Several of his close friends declined his invitations to join him in Basel, and the loneliness weighed heavily on him. Adding to his frustration, Nietzsche's request to take over the chair of philosophy at the university was denied, further compounding his sense of dissatisfaction with his academic position. This period of Nietzsche's life was characterized by growing inner conflict. On one hand, he was part of a vibrant intellectual circle that included one of his greatest idols, Richard Wagner. Yet on the other hand, his personal ambitions and health struggles left him increasingly dissatisfied. These tensions would shape much of his thinking in the years to come, as Nietzsche sought to break free from the constraints of both academia and conventional philosophy. While convalescing in the serene town of Lugano in Italian Switzerland, Nietzsche began to channel his energies into a project that would ultimately reshape his intellectual trajectory. During this period of recovery, he worked on a comprehensive study of ancient Greek tragedy, which would later be published in December 1871 under the title The Birth of Tragedy. In this groundbreaking work, Nietzsche delved deep into the nature of Greek drama, identifying a profound tension at its core, what he termed the struggle between Apollonian and Dionysian forces. These forces, Nietzsche argued, represented two contrasting principles of existence. The Apollonian symbolized order, reason, and harmony, characteristics associated with the god Apollo, who ruled over music and dance. On the other hand, the Dionysian embodied chaos, emotion, and ecstatic experience, qualities tied to Dionysius, the Greek god of wine, excess, and madness. Nietzsche theorized that these two opposing forces found their highest expression in Greek tragedy, where a balance was struck between Apollonian restraint and Dionysian passion. Music, in Nietzsche's view, was the purest manifestation of the Dionysian spirit. He speculated that the epic poetry of ancient Greece, including the works of Homer, was deeply influenced by music and its emotional power. In writing The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche sought to demonstrate that this delicate interplay of order and chaos, reason and emotion, was the key to understanding not only Greek art, but human existence itself. Nietzsche dedicated his work to Richard Wagner, whom he considered to be the modern equivalent of the ancient Greek tragedians. Nietzsche believed that Wagner, in his operatic compositions, had achieved a perfect synthesis of Apollonian and Dionysian elements, thereby reviving the dramatic spirit of classical Greece in modern art. Wagner was thrilled by Nietzsche's analysis and praised the book as a remarkable achievement. He even requested Nietzsche to send copies to his powerful patron, King Ludwig II of Bavaria, and to his father-in-law, the celebrated composer Franz Liszt. Despite the enthusiasm with which the book was received among artists, musicians, and certain members of the cultural elite, The Birth of Tragedy did not fare as well within academic circles. Nietzsche's bold, speculative approach to philology, often more philosophical and artistic than strictly scientific, ruffled the feathers of many of his colleagues. Nietzsche's former mentor, Friedrich Nietzsche, was among those who criticized the book, leaving Nietzsche disheartened. Yet, despite the academic pushback, The Birth of Tragedy remains a work of immense originality, offering readers a fresh and imaginative interpretation of classical Greek culture. Nietzsche was already forging a distinctive intellectual path, one that challenged the conventions of his time and laid the foundation for his later philosophical explorations. In the early 1870s, Nietzsche began to see himself and Wagner as cultural revolutionaries, leading a movement to restore German culture to the heights it had reached during the turn of the 19th century, the golden age of Kant, Mozart, Goethe, and Beethoven. Nietzsche believed that modern German society had fallen into a state of cultural decline, and he envisioned himself and Wagner as the vanguard of a cultural revival that would elevate Germany back to its former greatness. In 1872, Nietzsche delivered a series of impassioned public lectures in which he fiercely criticized the German education system. He warned against the growing trend toward the democratization of education, which, in his view, threatened to undermine intellectual and cultural excellence. While Nietzsche acknowledged the need for practical education to train state officials, farmers, and factory workers, he was deeply troubled by the increasing emphasis on utilitarianism in education. He argued that cultural education and intellectual pursuits were being eroded in favor of a narrow, functional approach that prioritized vocational training over scholarly inquiry. In Nietzsche's mind, education should not merely serve the purpose of preparing individuals for professions, but should be an end in itself, an opportunity for individuals to engage with the highest forms of human thought and creativity. These lectures reflected Nietzsche's growing dissatisfaction with the modern world and his desire to resist what he saw as a creeping mediocrity in contemporary German society. His critique of the education system was not just a condemnation of current practices, but a broader reflection of his deep concern for the future of German culture and intellectual life. In May 1872, Nietzsche traveled to Bayreuth to witness a momentous event, the laying of the foundation stone for Richard Wagner's new theater, a grand project constructed entirely to Wagner's specifications. This theater was intended to be the site for his grand operatic vision, most notably the Ring Cycle. Nietzsche, as always, was deeply invested in Wagner's projects, both emotionally and intellectually, and the ceremony was a significant occasion for him. However, upon returning to Basel, Nietzsche found himself embroiled in a fierce public debate. His recently published book, The Birth of Tragedy, had sparked a storm of criticism in the national press, particularly from his academic peers in the field of philology. While the attention brought him some degree of notoriety, Nietzsche quickly realized that the overwhelming response from his fellow scholars was negative. Many of his colleagues saw his approach as too speculative and insufficiently rigorous for serious philological scholarship. After spending his summer vacation in Italy, Nietzsche returned to Basel to face further disappointment. Only 2 students had signed up for his course on Greek and Roman rhetoric, a stark indication of his waning influence in the academic world. He was even forced to cancel a planned lecture series on Homer due to lack of interest. Nevertheless, Nietzsche was not easily deterred. Instead of giving in to frustration, he shifted his focus to a new intellectual project, an exploration of the pre-Socratic Greek philosophers. He envisioned this study as a tribute to Wagner and hoped to complete it in time for the composer's 60th birthday in May 1873. The proposed title was Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, and it was intended to further his exploration of Greek culture, building on the themes of the birth of tragedy. In early April, Nietzsche visited the Wagners in Bayreuth to inspect the progress on the new theater. However, his trip proved disappointing. When Nietzsche read excerpts from his latest work to Wagner and his circle, the reception was lukewarm at best. Hoping to improve the atmosphere, Nietzsche sat down at the piano to perform one of his compositions, but this too was met with an awkward response. By May, Nietzsche had almost finished his new book when another intellectual distraction arose: the publication of The Old and New Faith by David Strauss. Strauss, whose earlier work Life of Jesus had once inspired Nietzsche to abandon his Christian faith, was now promoting a vision of progressive Christianity. In this new book, Strauss sharply criticized the pessimism of philosophers like Schopenhauer, whom Nietzsche greatly admired. Strauss went so far as to describe Schopenhauer's worldview as the product of a putrefying brain, a remark that infuriated Nietzsche. Enraged by Strauss's dismissal of Schopenhauer, Nietzsche launched into a scathing polemic. He saw Strauss not only as a symbol of superficial intellectual trends, but as the embodiment of a broader cultural Philistinism that, in Nietzsche's view, had come to dominate Germany. This modern Philistinism, according to Nietzsche, sought easy and comforting answers rather than the pursuit of truth and beauty. Determined to strike back, Nietzsche penned an essay attacking Strauss, which would later become the first in a series of 4 essays published together as Untimely Meditations in 1876. In the next essay in this series, titled On the Use and Abuse of History for Life, Nietzsche turned his critical gaze toward the study of history itself. He argued that the past should be studied not for the sake of idle admiration or hero worship, but as a means of inspiring future greatness. Nietzsche warned against the tendency to mythologize historical figures and events, which he believed could distort the lessons history had to offer. Instead, he advocated for a more dynamic and forward-looking approach to history, one that encouraged the continual re-evaluation of the past in light of the future. Moreover, Nietzsche took aim at the increasingly scientific approach to history that had gained prominence in Germany. He believed this methodology reduced history to mere facts and chronologies, stripping it of its power to inspire and shape human life. In another essay from this period, Titled Schopenhauer as Educator, Nietzsche praised the philosopher who had liberated him from conventional thinking. Nietzsche admired Schopenhauer for his ability to free his readers from the constraints of societal norms and expectations, urging them to seek their own paths in life. Nietzsche's admiration for Schopenhauer's rebellious spirit was palpable, and this essay stands as a testament to the profound influence Schopenhauer had on his intellectual development. For the fourth and final essay in the Untimely Meditations, Nietzsche turned his attention to the subject of art, particularly the work of his great friend and mentor, Richard Wagner. The essay, titled Richard Wagner and Bayreuth, was a tribute to the composer's artistic genius. Although Nietzsche had completed most of the work by early 1875, his ongoing health issues, marked by bouts of near blindness, delayed its publication. The exact nature of Nietzsche's illnesses has been the subject of much speculation and debate among scholars, with no definitive diagnosis having emerged even after more than a century of inquiry. Despite these physical setbacks, Nietzsche's intellect remained as sharp and provocative as ever. His essays and Untimely Meditations reflect his growing disillusionment with many aspects of modern life, from religion and history to education and art. Yet, through it all, Nietzsche never lost sight of his belief in the potential for human greatness, a theme that would continue to shape his thought in the years to come. By the mid-1870s, Nietzsche's health had continued to deteriorate, with many speculating that he was suffering from tertiary syphilis, a condition that could explain some of his neurological symptoms. However, it is also possible that Nietzsche was afflicted by a variety of ailments, which worsened over time. He frequently suffered from debilitating gastric spasms, hemorrhoids, severe headaches, and increasingly poor eyesight. These issues were compounded by episodes of fainting spells and fits, leading some modern scholars to wonder whether Nietzsche might have been dealing with a brain tumor. Whatever the cause, his health was a constant source of frustration and would plague him for the rest of his life. It wasn't until July 1876 that Nietzsche was able to recover sufficiently from his latest bout of illness to complete his manuscript, Richard Wagner and Bayreuth. His work on the essay had been greatly aided by a young admirer, Heinrich Koselleck, a musician who would later adopt the pseudonym Peter Gast. Koselleck would become a loyal supporter of Nietzsche, often assisting him with writing and other tasks as his health deteriorated. Once finished, copies of Richard Wagner and Bayreuth were quickly dispatched to Wagner himself, who urged Nietzsche to join him in Bayreuth to witness the final rehearsals for the long-awaited premiere of the Ring cycle. Nietzsche arrived in Bayreuth on July 22, 1876, but was quickly disillusioned by the atmosphere. The town was crowded with aristocrats and society figures, most of whom had come not out of admiration for Wagner's revolutionary music, but for the social spectacle of the event. Nietzsche, who had never been comfortable in such company, was eager to avoid the crowds. In fact, he even declined an invitation to meet King Ludwig II of Bavaria, one of Wagner's most devoted patrons. The disconnect between Nietzsche's idealistic vision of art and the reality of the social scene in Bayreuth marked the beginning of a deeper rift between him and Wagner, which would only grow in the years to come. Following this experience, Nietzsche was granted a year-long sabbatical from the University of Basel, a much-needed respite from both his academic duties and his deteriorating health. He spent the first part of this leave in Italy, staying with Malwida von Meysenbug, a German aristocrat who had turned away from her family's conservative values to embrace revolutionary causes in Europe. A fervent admirer of both Wagner and Nietzsche, Meysenbug had met Nietzsche several years earlier in Munich and quickly became one of his closest confidants, despite being nearly 3 decades his senior. In the autumn of 1876, Nietzsche traveled to Sorrento on the Bay of Naples, accompanied by 2 friends, Albert Brenner, a fellow intellectual, and Dr. Paul Rée, a former student who would have a significant influence on Nietzsche's evolving philosophy. It was during this period in Sorrento that Nietzsche's admiration for Schopenhauer began to wane. Under Rie's influence, Nietzsche began to question Schopenhauer's deeply pessimistic view of life, seeking instead a more life-affirming perspective. This intellectual shift coincided with growing tensions between Nietzsche and Wagner, particularly over Wagner's increasingly strident German nationalism, which Nietzsche found troubling. These philosophical differences were exacerbated by Wagner's realization that Nietzsche, with his ever-worsening health, would likely never be able to fulfill Wagner's ambition for him to edit a journal that would promote his ideas about art and music. Upon his return to Basel in late 1877, Nietzsche sought medical advice from Dr. Otto Isser in Frankfurt, who diagnosed a damaged optic nerve as the cause of his worsening vision. The doctor's prescription was severe. Nietzsche was advised to avoid reading and writing altogether for several years in order to preserve what was left of his eyesight. However, this was a recommendation Nietzsche was never going to follow. His drive to think, write, and engage with ideas was far too powerful for him to simply put aside, regardless of the toll it took on his body. During his sabbatical, Nietzsche had begun working on what was initially intended to be the fifth essay in his Untimely meditations, focusing on the human condition. However, as he continued to develop the manuscript, it grew far beyond the scope of a single essay. By the time he finished, it had transformed into an entirely new work, Human, All Too Human. Published in the spring of 1878, the book was a collection of 638 aphorisms, a format Nietzsche chose to communicate his ideas concisely rather than in a systematic, academic style. In Human, All Too Human, Nietzsche set forth one of his most radical claims, that there are no eternal truths. This was a direct challenge to the foundational ideas of both Kant and Schopenhauer, whom Nietzsche now viewed as having been misguided in their quest to uncover universal truths about existence. Nietzsche's turn away from metaphysical certainties marked a decisive shift in his philosophy, one that would have profound implications for his later work. With Human, All Too Human, Nietzsche began to establish himself as a philosopher who rejected traditional systems of thought, favoring instead a more fluid and questioning approach to the world. This new direction would lead him further and further away from his early influences, including both Schopenhauer and Wagner, and toward the development of his own unique philosophical vision. In a striking departure from his earlier philosophical positions, Nietzsche now began to elevate science above art in terms of its importance to human progress. He argued that even small scientific discoveries had contributed significantly to advancing human understanding and improving life. Although he continued to appreciate art's value, Nietzsche now saw it as a bridge, a transitional tool, to help humanity move away from religion and superstition and toward a more free-spirited and rational worldview. This shift was reflected in the subtitle of his work, A Book for Free Spirits, which indicated his desire to liberate minds from traditional beliefs and conventions. One of the central themes in Human, All Too Human was Nietzsche's sustained critique of Christianity. He asserted that the core tenets of Christianity lacked any rational or scientific foundation. In his view, Christianity's concepts of good and evil were not objective truths, but rather socially constructed ideas that no longer had a place in a modern world shaped by reason and science. Nietzsche was well aware that his bold critiques would provoke outrage from his former friend Richard Wagner, so he chose not to send Wagner a copy of the book. Despite this, Wagner obtained a copy through their mutual publisher, Ernst Schmeitzner. However, Wagner reportedly read only a few pages before setting the book aside, preferring not to disrupt his positive memories of Nietzsche's earlier work. Nietzsche's rejection of traditional morality, particularly in Human, All Too Human, also alienated many of his friends and supporters. Some were disturbed by his increasing dismissal of conventional moral values. Rather than retreat in the face of criticism, Nietzsche decided to expand on these controversial ideas. He quickly penned a second volume, subtitled Mixed Opinions and Maxims, in which he further explored his critique of Christian morality. Nietzsche argued that Christian humility and self-denial were not noble virtues, but rather expressions of a selfish desire to avoid eternal damnation. In his view, Christianity was nothing more than a cult of suffering, encouraging people to glorify pain and sacrifice in the name of salvation. By May 1879, Nietzsche's health had reached a critical point, forcing him to request a formal release from his teaching duties at the University of Basel. At just 35 years old, Nietzsche's health struggles had taken a severe toll on him, but his intellectual evolution during his years in Basel had laid the groundwork for his later philosophical achievements. Now free from the constraints of academia, Nietzsche found himself with more time to devote to writing and thinking. Although he would have to survive on a modest pension of 3,000 Swiss francs per year from the university, supplemented occasionally by financial assistance from family and friends, Nietzsche was about to enter the most productive phase of his life. Despite his health problems, Nietzsche's newfound freedom allowed him to focus on his work like never before. By the autumn of 1879, he had already written another collection of aphorisms, The Wanderer and His Shadow. In this work, Nietzsche continued to challenge deeply held beliefs, including the idea of salvation and metaphysical concerns. He argued that people should not be preoccupied with abstract notions such as the salvation of the soul. Nietzsche's critique extended to the philosophies of the Enlightenment, particularly Jean-Jacques Rousseau's famous claim that man is born free, but everywhere is in chains. Nietzsche rejected Rousseau's view, suggesting instead that human societies did not form as a result of people voluntarily sacrificing their freedoms for the common good, but rather as a response to external threats. Early systems of justice, Nietzsche contended, were not based on fairness or social harmony, but were, in essence, legalized systems of revenge. The title The Wanderer and His Shadow reflected Nietzsche's exploration of both the positive and negative aspects of various issues. One such example was his view on war. While Nietzsche acknowledged war's destructive nature, he also argued that it could serve as a catalyst for rejuvenating stagnant communities and resolving long-standing tensions. These perspectives were often controversial, but many of Nietzsche's ideas in The Wanderer and His Shadow have since been incorporated into the study of anthropology and the early development of human societies. As Nietzsche's philosophical output increased, so did the deterioration of his health. The winter of 1879 proved to be especially harsh for him, forcing Nietzsche to spend most of 1880 traveling in search of more suitable climates. In February of that year, he journeyed to the northern Italian lakes, where he met up with his young friend and admirer, Heinrich Koselleck. The two traveled together to Venice, a city that Nietzsche found invigorating. Koselleck's companionship proved invaluable, as he not only provided emotional support, but also helped transcribe Nietzsche's often illegible drafts into readable manuscripts. Despite Nietzsche's enjoyment of Venice, the oppressive summer heat forced him to leave, and he sought refuge in Marienbad, a fashionable spa town in what is now the Czech Republic. After spending the summer in various locations, Nietzsche returned to his family in Naumburg in September 1881, but did not stay long. In October, he once again traveled to Italy, hoping to avoid the harshness of the German winter. This time, he settled in the coastal city of Genoa. Despite his recurring health issues, Nietzsche was incredibly productive during this period. By February 1881, he had already completed the draft of his next major work, Morgenrot, translated as Daybreak or Morning Glow, which would be published later that year in June. Though Nietzsche had high expectations for Morgenrot, the book would ultimately remain one of his lesser-known works. Nevertheless, it played a significant role in advancing his philosophical critique of Christianity. In Morgenrot, Nietzsche continued to develop his argument that Christianity had stunted human progress by promoting values that were not aligned with natural human instincts. In contrast to Christianity, Nietzsche expressed a growing appreciation for Eastern philosophies, particularly Buddhism. He admired Buddhism's rejection of the need for gods and its focus on the individual's spiritual fulfillment, which stood in stark opposition to the Christian emphasis on sin and divine judgment. In this way, Nietzsche began to shift his focus from merely critiquing Western religious traditions to exploring alternatives from other parts of the world. By January 1882, Nietzsche experienced a rare period of improved health. During this time, he was delighted to be joined by his close friend and fellow philosopher Paul Rée, who had brought along a typewriter to assist Nietzsche with his writing. Typewriters were a relatively new technology, having only become commercially available in the late 1860s. Nietzsche, who was using one for the first time, initially struggled with the machine. His deteriorating eyesight made it difficult for him to locate the correct keys, and the strain on his eyes only exacerbated his health problems. Now approaching his late 30s, Nietzsche made a playful remark to Rée that perhaps it was time for him to get married. The idea of marriage had come up in their previous conversations, particularly during their time in Sorrento with Mailhida von Meysenbug, a German writer and close friend of Nietzsche. However, Nietzsche's casual comment about marriage was not necessarily serious, as he had always been more concerned with finding intellectual companionship than romantic relationships. After spending 5 weeks with Nietzsche in Genoa, Rée continued his journey to Rome, where he stayed with Meysenbug. During his time there, Rée met a young woman who would soon become an important figure in Nietzsche's life, Salomé. Salomé was a 21-year-old Russian-born poet and intellectual, known for her rebellious views on religion and morality. She had studied theology but became disillusioned with the religious teachings she had received, rejecting much of the moral instruction she had been given. Rée was captivated by Salomé's sharp intellect and independent spirit and encouraged Nietzsche to meet her. After a brief stay in Messina, Sicily, Nietzsche arrived in Rome in mid-April 1882 to meet Salomé for the first time. Their initial encounters were somewhat awkward, but Nietzsche quickly recognized Salomé's intellectual potential. In Salomé, Nietzsche believed he had found a kindred spirit, someone who could serve as his intellectual companion and perhaps even help him continue his philosophical work. While Salomé would later claim that Nietzsche proposed marriage to her during a meeting in Lucerne in May 1882, Nietzsche maintained that he had no romantic intentions toward her. His interest in Salomé was purely intellectual, in contrast to Paul Rée, who had developed romantic feelings for her and wrote her many love letters. The trio, Nietzsche, Rée, and Salomé, soon devised an unconventional plan to live together in a philosophical commune in Vienna. Salomé envisioned a communal lifestyle where they could focus on intellectual pursuits without the distractions of conventional social norms. Nietzsche's friends were skeptical of the arrangement, but Nietzsche dismissed any rumors of romantic involvement, insisting that his relationship with Salomé was purely intellectual. He even declared his intention to train her as his intellectual successor. However, tension soon arose when Nietzsche arranged for his sister, Elizabeth, to meet Salomé in July 1882 in Bayreuth during a performance of Richard Wagner's opera Parsifal, which Nietzsche despised for its overt Christian themes. Although outwardly friendly, Elizabeth was deeply resentful of Salomé, viewing her as a threat to her close bond with her brother. Meanwhile, Nietzsche continued to produce groundbreaking philosophical work. In 1882, he published Die Fröhliche Wissenschaft, known in English as The Gay Science or The Joyous Science. This work marked a significant development in Nietzsche's thinking, as it combined his critiques of religion with an endorsement of Charles Darwin's theory of biological evolution. Though Darwin's ideas had been published more than 2 decades earlier in On the Origin of Species, they remained highly controversial, especially in religious circles. Nietzsche admired Darwin's emphasis on the natural processes that governed life on Earth, but simultaneously challenged the Darwinian concept of the survival of the fittest. Nietzsche observed that while the theory of survival seemed to imply that only the strongest and most adaptable individuals would thrive, many of history's greatest contributors to art and culture had died young without leaving descendants. For instance, he pointed to the Renaissance painter Raphael and the composer Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, both of whom made profound cultural contributions despite their premature deaths. Nietzsche argued that the human purpose could not be reduced to mere survival. For him, life was not just about enduring hardships, but about creating and contributing to the elevation of human culture, often at great personal cost. Nietzsche argued that human existence was characterized by both comedy and tragedy. The comedic aspect arose from humanity's inflated sense of self-importance, the vain belief that short-lived human beings could somehow master the vast forces of nature. On the other hand, the tragic element stemmed from the recognition that humans were only a minute part of the cosmos, ultimately powerless against the inexorable forces of nature and time. This tragic dimension haunted Nietzsche's philosophy, which he acknowledged even in Die Fröhliche Wissenschaft, The Joyous Science, a book he had titled in a spirit of irony. Toward the end of The Joyous Science, Nietzsche issued a provocative call to arms. He urged his readers to join him in waging an intellectual war on behalf of science against religion, marking a significant escalation in his critique of Christianity. Nietzsche believed that science, grounded in reason and empirical observation, had the potential to challenge the dogmatic grip of religious thought, which he saw as holding humanity back from realizing its full potential. The Joyous Science was also notable for Nietzsche's attempt to apply Charles Darwin's evolutionary theory to a new understanding of cultural evolution. Just as species adapted over time to their environments, Nietzsche argued that human cultures were also subject to a form of evolution. This idea, however, was not without its paradoxes. Despite calling the book The Joyous Science, Nietzsche's final conclusion remained pessimistic. The tragic aspects of existence, he believed, would always outweigh any fleeting joy. In his view, human life was defined by suffering, limitation, and the knowledge of inevitable death. Yet despite this dark philosophical outlook, Nietzsche's personal encounters with Salomé had sparked within him a rare sense of optimism. In August 1882, Nietzsche and Salomé spent 3 weeks together in the Tottenberg forest in Saxony, engaging in long philosophical discussions. Nietzsche later described this period as one of the happiest times of his life. However, this brief interlude of happiness was marred by tension, particularly regarding his family's objections to his relationship with Salomé. Both Nietzsche's mother and his sister Elizabeth were scandalized by the unconventional nature of his interactions with the young Russian intellectual. Disagreements about the propriety of his relationship led to strained relations between Nietzsche and his family, forcing him to leave Naumburg and move to Leipzig. As Nietzsche settled in Leipzig, the fragile dynamic between him, and Salomé began to deteriorate. Who had initially encouraged Nietzsche to meet Salomé, soon became jealous of the time Nietzsche was spending alone with her. Had developed romantic feelings for Salomé and was deeply resentful of Nietzsche's intellectual closeness to her. At the same time, Salomé, independent and strong-willed, had no intention of becoming a mere disciple or subject to Nietzsche's intellectual control. What Nietzsche had initially hoped would be a productive intellectual partnership began to unravel under the weight of conflicting emotions and unmet expectations. Privately, Nietzsche struggled with his growing attraction to Salomé. His notebooks from this period reveal that his feelings for her had evolved from intellectual admiration to something more physical. This shift in his desires only compounded his emotional distress when the relationship between the trio began to disintegrate in the following weeks. Nietzsche became increasingly despondent, slipping into a deep depression. To cope with both his physical ailments and emotional turmoil, he turned to opium, taking larger and larger doses as the months wore on. By the time Nietzsche retreated to Rapallo, Italy, in early 1883, his correspondence with Rie and Salomé had grown increasingly bitter. Nietzsche's letters to them were filled with anger and frustration, but these attempts to mend the fractured relationship were futile. The trio's bond was irreparably damaged, and they gradually drifted apart. Nietzsche's hopes for a lasting intellectual partnership with Salomé were dashed, and the emotional fallout left him feeling more isolated than ever. Despite the personal turmoil he was experiencing, this period also marked the beginning of one of the most intellectually productive phases of Nietzsche's life. It was during his time in Rapallo that Nietzsche began working on what would become his magnum opus, also Sprach Zarathustra, thus spake Zarathustra. In this groundbreaking work, Nietzsche sought to forge a new philosophical path, one that was wholly his own and independent of the influences of Schopenhauer, Kant, and other prominent thinkers of the time. Nietzsche was determined to break away from the intellectual traditions of the past and articulate a distinctly Nietzschean philosophy. The title of the work referred to Zoroaster, the ancient Persian prophet who founded Zoroastrianism, one of the world's first monotheistic religions. Zoroaster's teachings revolved around a cosmic struggle between the creator god, Ahura Mazda, and the evil spirit Ahriman, a dualistic battle between good and evil. While Nietzsche rejected the dichotomy of good versus evil that Zoroastrianism introduced, a dichotomy that he believed had deeply influenced Christianity, he saw Zoroaster as a symbolic figure who challenged the prevailing norms of his time. In Thus Spake Zarathustra, Nietzsche used Zoroaster as a literary and philosophical mouthpiece through which he could present his own revolutionary ideas. He envisioned Zoroaster not as a religious figure, but as a prophet of change, someone who questioned the status quo and dared to offer radical alternatives to traditional morality. Through Zarathustra's teachings, Nietzsche outlined his vision of a future where humanity could transcend the constraints of conventional morality and embrace a new set of values centered on the will to power and the creation of meaning in a world devoid of inherent purpose. Thus Spake Zarathustra would go on to become Nietzsche's most famous and influential work, introducing ideas that would shape much of modern philosophy, including the concept of the Übermensch, Overman or Superman, and the declaration that God is dead. These ideas were radical, and Nietzsche's use of a prophetic figure like Zoroaster only emphasized the revolutionary nature of his thought. Nietzsche wrote the first part of Thus Spake Zarathustra in a creative frenzy, completing it within just 10 days in late January 1883. This rapid burst of productivity was characteristic of Nietzsche's writing process during this period, as he channeled his emotional turmoil and intellectual energy into crafting one of the most original works of modern philosophy. The timing of this first section of Zarathustra was soon marked by a profound personal moment. A few weeks after completing the manuscript, Nietzsche received the unexpected news that Richard Wagner, his former mentor and friend, had passed away in Venice. Although Nietzsche and Wagner had not seen each other in over 6 years, the composer's death had a powerful effect on Nietzsche. Their once close relationship had unraveled during the mid-1870s due to deep ideological differences, particularly concerning Wagner's growing nationalism and Christianity, which Nietzsche increasingly rejected. Yet despite this falling out, Nietzsche never completely abandoned his admiration for aspects of Wagner's artistic genius. Wagner's death, then, represented not only the loss of a significant personal relationship, but also the symbolic closing of a chapter in Nietzsche's life. In the spring of 1883, Nietzsche sought to heal another broken relationship, this time with his sister, Elizabeth. During a visit to Rome in April, Nietzsche reconciled with Elizabeth, with whom he had become estranged after blaming her for the collapse of his plans with Salomé. Elizabeth's role in the disintegration of Nietzsche's relationship with Salomé had caused considerable tension between the siblings, but their time in Rome allowed for some level of reconciliation, at least temporarily. By June, Nietzsche returned to one of his favorite retreats, the Swiss mountain village of Sils Maria. Nestled in the Engadine Valley, Sils Maria provided Nietzsche with a serene environment in which he could reflect and continue his work. However, his peace was soon disrupted by frustration with his Leipzig publisher, Ernst Schmeitzner, who had delayed the publication of the first part of Zarathustra. Nietzsche speculated that the delay was due to the controversial nature of the text, particularly Zoroaster's bold declaration that God is dead, a statement that would become one of the most famous lines in modern philosophy. The paradox of thus spake Zarathustra lay in its dual message. On one hand, Nietzsche argued that the rise of science and the increasing secularization of society would inevitably lead to the death of Christianity. In Nietzsche's view, the advent of modernity had made it impossible for traditional religious beliefs to continue holding sway over humanity. The age of faith was giving way to an age of reason. Yet, on the other hand, Nietzsche framed his character, Zarathustra, in a way that paralleled Jesus Christ. In fact, Nietzsche often referred to Zarathustra as his fifth gospel, suggesting that it was a philosophical counterpart to the Christian Gospels. These apparent contradictions in Nietzsche's thought can be better understood through his concept of the Übermensch, Overman or Superman. Nietzsche envisioned humanity moving beyond the religious stage of its development toward a new phase, one in which the old moral frameworks were cast aside in favor of a new, higher culture. The Übermensch would embody this new stage of human evolution, transcending the limitations of conventional morality and creating values rooted in rationality and self-affirmation. By July 1883, Nietzsche had completed the second part of Zarathustra. In this section, consisting of 22 further discourses, Nietzsche intensified his critique of Christianity. He denounced what he saw as the hypocrisy of Christians who pursued self-denial and virtuousness not for its own sake, but in the hope of securing a place in a heavenly afterlife. Nietzsche was deeply critical of this otherworldly focus of Christianity, which he believed devalued life on earth and encouraged a kind of spiritual cowardice. During the writing of the second part, Nietzsche began to develop one of his most significant philosophical ideas, the will to power. Building on his earlier rejection of Arthur Schopenhauer's notion of life as a blind, aimless struggle for survival, Nietzsche proposed instead that life was fundamentally a struggle for mastery and control. He argued that all human relationships, and indeed all interactions within the natural world, were marked by a desire for power. In Nietzsche's view, no relationship between two people was free from this dynamic. The will to power was always at play, whether overtly or subtly. This idea of power extended to Nietzsche's analysis of Christianity's historical success. He argued that the rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire was not due to its moral teachings or divine inspiration, but rather because the emperors recognized its utility in consolidating their own power. By adopting Christianity as the official religion, the Roman rulers found a way to strengthen their control over the populace. However, as Christianity grew into a powerful institution during the medieval period, Nietzsche believed it had become increasingly estranged from the original moral message of Christ. The Church, particularly the bishops of Rome, had become preoccupied with accumulating wealth and influence, thereby betraying the spiritual core of the religion. Nietzsche's critique of Christianity, therefore, was not only philosophical but also historical. He viewed the development of Christianity as a story of power and domination, rather than one of spiritual enlightenment. For Nietzsche, the solution to this problem was the creation of a new morality, one that rejected the life-denying values of Christianity and embraced the life-affirming principles of the Übermensch. By early 1884, Nietzsche had completed the third part of Thus Spake Zarathustra, during a stay in Nice. In this section, Zarathustra returns to the mountains, where he contemplates one of Nietzsche's most challenging and controversial ideas, the concept of eternal recurrence. Nietzsche posited that if time was truly infinite, then every event that has occurred in the past must inevitably occur again and again in an endless cycle of repetition. This idea was profoundly unsettling, as it suggested that humanity was trapped in an eternal loop, unable to escape the events of the past. For Nietzsche, the notion of eternal recurrence was a test of strength. Only those who could embrace the idea of living their lives over and over again, without regret or despair, could achieve the status of the Übermensch. This acceptance of life's cyclical nature was, in Nietzsche's view, the ultimate affirmation of existence. While the collective evolution of humanity might never fully reach its potential, the individual could still find meaning and solace in the eternal return of all things. In the end, Nietzsche's Zarathustra finds a sense of peace in the idea of eternity, even as he acknowledges the tragic limitations of human existence. Through the lens of eternal recurrence, Nietzsche sought to challenge his readers to confront the harsh realities of life and to find a way to affirm their existence in the face of inevitable suffering and repetition. Although Nietzsche had originally intended for the third part of Thus Spake Zarathustra to conclude the philosophical narrative, his creative momentum pushed him to continue. In January 1885, he wrote an additional 20 scenes that would form a fourth part of Zarathustra. However, the content of these new writings was so explicitly sacrilegious that Nietzsche hesitated to release them to the general public. These scenes were radical, even by Nietzsche's standards, filled with a provocative and direct critique of religious institutions and sacred beliefs. Recognizing the controversial nature of the text, Nietzsche decided to limit the print run of this fourth part to just 40 copies. These exclusive copies were distributed only among a select group of friends and colleagues, individuals Nietzsche believed could appreciate his uncompromising vision. The printing of these limited copies was handled by Konstantin Naumann, a Leipzig printer who had also been responsible for the publication of the first 3 volumes of Zarathustra at the request of Nietzsche's former publisher, Ernst Schmeitzner. By this time, however, Nietzsche had broken ties with Schmeitzner, who had been reluctant to publish Nietzsche's more controversial works. Nietzsche's strained relationship with Schmeitzner was indicative of the growing isolation Nietzsche felt as his ideas became more radical and his works more challenging for the mainstream to accept. While Nietzsche was preoccupied with his writing, his personal life was once again affected by the actions of his sister, Elizabeth. In 1885, Nietzsche received the troubling news that Elizabeth was planning to marry Dr. Bernhard Forster, a Wagner-phile and a German nationalist with extremist views. Forster's radical opinions had cost him his teaching positions, and he had devised a plan to establish a utopian German nationalist community in South America. Both Nietzsche and his mother were strongly opposed to the marriage, viewing Forster as an unsuitable match for Elizabeth. However, despite their objections, Elizabeth and Forster married in May 1885 and soon after departed for Paraguay, where they would attempt to realize Forster's vision of a nationalist colony. This chapter of Nietzsche's life was marked by both creative breakthroughs and personal challenges. After completing Zarathustra, Nietzsche felt that he had exhausted the use of ancient religious figures as mouthpieces for his philosophy. He decided to return to more conventional philosophical writing, crafting treatises that presented his ideas directly, without the narrative structure or allegorical devices he had employed in Zarathustra. By March 1886, Nietzsche had completed Beyond Good and Evil, a work that synthesized many of the ideas he had been developing over the past few years. However, despite the importance Nietzsche placed on this new book, he faced significant difficulties in finding a publisher willing to take it on. His previous works, including Zarathustra, had not sold well, and hundreds of unsold copies of his earlier books were languishing in storage. Publishers, wary of the financial risks, were hesitant to take a chance on Nietzsche's latest project. Eventually, Nietzsche was forced to publish Beyond Good and Evil at his own expense, ordering an initial print run of 1,250 copies. Nietzsche's struggles with finding a publisher reflected the broader difficulties he faced in gaining recognition for his work during his lifetime. His ideas, which were often perceived as too radical, found little resonance in the intellectual and cultural climate of his time. Nevertheless, Nietzsche regarded Beyond Good and Evil as a concise and powerful statement of his philosophical beliefs. In this book, he launched another scathing critique of the forces of democratization and egalitarianism, trends that he saw as dangerous developments rooted in Christianity's emphasis on equality and compassion for the weak. For Nietzsche, the rise of democracy and egalitarianism represented a continuation of what he viewed as the decline of European civilization. In his eyes, these movements threatened to undermine the creative potential of humanity by elevating mediocrity and suppressing the natural hierarchy that had once driven cultural and intellectual progress. Nietzsche argued that many of the greatest achievements in human history had taken place in aristocratic societies, where a select few individuals had the freedom and opportunity to pursue greatness without being constrained by the values of the masses. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche expanded on his critique of morality, which he viewed as an artificial construct designed to control individuals within society. He introduced the concept of two distinct types of morality: slave morality and master morality. According to Nietzsche, slave morality arose from the resentment of the weak against the strong. It was a morality that prized values like humility, compassion, and self-denial, values that, in Nietzsche's view, served to protect the powerless by condemning the natural instincts of strength and ambition. Christianity, Nietzsche argued, was the ultimate expression of slave morality, having elevated these values to a universal moral code. In contrast, Nietzsche described master morality as the morality of the strong, the rulers, and the creators. This form of morality was based on the affirmation of life, the pursuit of power, and the celebration of individual greatness. It rejected the constraints of conventional morality and instead embraced the natural instincts of dominance, creativity, and self-overcoming. Nietzsche believed that human progress and cultural flourishing had always been driven by individuals who embodied master morality, those who dared to assert their will and rise above the mediocrity of the masses. Beyond Good and Evil was Nietzsche's call for a revaluation of all values, a challenge to the moral and cultural assumptions that had shaped Western civilization for centuries. He urged his readers to reject the moral dogmas of the past and to embrace a new ethos, one that celebrated strength, creativity, and the will to power. However, like much of Nietzsche's work, Beyond Good and Evil was not widely understood or appreciated during his lifetime. It would take many years before the full impact of his ideas was recognized, and by then, Nietzsche himself would be lost to the world, having descended into madness. Nietzsche had high hopes for Beyond Good and Evil. He viewed it as a crucial statement of his philosophical ideas and believed it had the potential to reach a wider audience than his earlier works. However, in February 1887, he was met with bitter disappointment when he learned that only 65 copies of the book had been sold. This was a devastating blow for Nietzsche, who had invested both financially and emotionally in the project. Despite the depth and complexity of the ideas presented in Beyond Good and Evil, it failed to capture the attention of the reading public during his lifetime. Nietzsche's philosophical insights, which challenged deeply ingrained societal values, were often too radical for the conventional readers of the time, who struggled to embrace his unconventional perspectives. However, among the few who did appreciate the book was Meta von Salis, a Swiss writer, historian, and pioneering intellectual figure. In 1887, Salis became the first woman in Switzerland to earn a doctorate, a significant achievement that underscored her trailblazing role as an academic and thinker. Nietzsche and Salis had known each other since 1884, and their friendship deepened over the years. Salis admired Nietzsche's intellect and vision, and the two shared a close bond that was built on mutual respect for each other's philosophical pursuits. During the summer of 1887, Salis visited Nietzsche at his retreat in Sils Maria, where they engaged in deep discussions about philosophy, morality, and the state of European society. Motivated by the desire to revive interest in beyond good and evil, and invigorated by his conversations with Salis, Nietzsche began working on a new philosophical treatise. He aimed to expand upon the ideas he had introduced in his previous work. The result was on the Genealogy of Morality, a text that would become one of Nietzsche's most significant contributions to moral philosophy. Drawing on his background in philology, the study of language and historical texts, Nietzsche began tracing the evolution of moral concepts over the centuries. He observed that the word for good in many ancient languages, such as Greek and Latin, was derived from terms associated with nobility, bravery, and strength. In contrast, the word for bad was often linked to words denoting the common or lowly, those seen as inferior or weak by the ruling classes. Nietzsche argued that this linguistic distinction reflected the values of early warrior societies, where power, courage, and dominance were celebrated, and weakness was despised. However, according to Nietzsche, this initial structure of morality began to shift with the rise of the priestly classes in ancient civilizations like the Levant and the broader Middle East. These religious leaders placed emphasis on purity, faith, and spiritual discipline, values that diverged from the heroic ideals of nobility and strength. The priestly morality promoted a sense of guilt and self-denial, encouraging individuals to reject worldly power and material success in favor of spiritual purity. Nietzsche viewed this transformation as the beginning of what he called slave morality, a value system that emerged from the resentment of the weak toward the powerful. In Nietzsche's view, the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth were the culmination of this priestly morality. Jesus encouraged sympathy for the poor, the suffering, and the downtrodden, offering them the promise of spiritual salvation in exchange for their acceptance of a lower position in society. Nietzsche saw this as the ultimate triumph of slave morality, where the values of the weak were elevated over those of the strong. Christianity, in Nietzsche's estimation, had successfully transformed moral values, promoting humility and meekness as virtues while denouncing the instincts of power and self-assertion. Yet, Nietzsche argued that this transformation was not universal. The warrior class of Germanic and Scandinavian tribes, who had conquered much of Europe following the collapse of the Roman Empire, initially resisted the full embrace of Christian morality. While these new rulers adopted Christianity as a religion, they maintained many of the hierarchical structures of the Roman Empire. The aristocratic values of the conquerors, inspired by Roman notions of power and order, persisted in European society for centuries. In this sense, Nietzsche credited these warrior societies with preventing Europe from becoming a total Christian theocracy after the fall of Rome. However, the forces of slave morality returned with renewed strength during the Protestant Reformation and the French Revolution. Nietzsche saw the Reformation, particularly in places like Calvinist Geneva, as a reassertion of the values of humility, piety, and asceticism. The French Revolution, with its emphasis on equality and the rights of the common people, represented a further triumph of slave morality, as the values of the masses were once again elevated over those of the aristocracy and the strong. The Genealogy of Morality explored these themes in rigorous detail, offering an analysis of how moral systems evolved over the course of millennia. Nietzsche traced the development of Judeo-Christian morality and its profound impact on Western thought and culture. While many of Nietzsche's readers might disagree with his conclusions, particularly his critique of Christian values and his defense of aristocratic hierarchy, there was no denying the intellectual rigor and historical depth of his analysis. The work demonstrated Nietzsche's exceptional skill in combining philosophy, history, and philology to explore the origins and transformations of moral values. Despite its controversial content, On the Genealogy of Morality remains one of Nietzsche's most influential works, offering a powerful critique of conventional morality and challenging readers to reconsider the foundations of their ethical beliefs. Nietzsche's arguments about the distinction between slave and master morality, and his critique of Christianity as a manifestation of the former, would have a profound impact on later generations of philosophers, shaping debates about ethics, power, and human nature for decades to come. Throughout his prolific period of writing, Nietzsche's health remained a constant struggle. He frequently suffered from debilitating migraines, nausea, and exhaustion, yet his creative output was astonishing, even during these times of ill health. Despite his physical difficulties, Nietzsche experienced a period of relative wellness during a stay in Nice in early 1888. For the first time in years, he found a level of physical comfort that allowed him to dive deeply into his philosophical work with renewed energy and clarity of thought. During this period, Nietzsche conceived of an ambitious project that he envisioned as the ultimate synthesis of his philosophical system. This would be a monumental four-volume work entitled The Will to Power, where he intended to present the crowning statement of his philosophy. Nietzsche viewed the will to power, the fundamental drive that animates all life, as the primary force shaping human behavior, history, and culture. This concept was central to his understanding of existence, and he sought to explore its full implications in this new project. However, by March 1888, Nietzsche recognized the enormity of this undertaking and the limitations of his own health. Realizing that the will to power was too ambitious to complete, he abandoned the idea, shelving it for the foreseeable future. As Nietzsche grappled with the direction of his work, he also sought out new environments that could inspire him and provide refuge from his constant health issues. In the spring of 1888, he chose to leave Nice and head to Turin, Italy, a city whose climate and vibrant cultural life, especially its music scene, filled him with joy. Nietzsche had long believed that certain places could enhance his well-being and fuel his creativity, and Turin did just that. He stayed in the city for 3 months, immersing himself in its intellectual and artistic atmosphere. During this time, Nietzsche's creativity surged once again. One of the first fruits of this creative burst was the case of Wagner, a scathing polemic against Richard Wagner, the very composer Nietzsche had once idolized. The case of Wagner marked a significant break from Nietzsche's earlier admiration for the composer. Where he had once seen Wagner as a revolutionary artist capable of reinvigorating European culture, Nietzsche now viewed him as a symbol of the decay and degeneration of modern Europe. In the book, Nietzsche argued that Wagner's music embodied the decadence of European art and society, promoting emotional excess and weakness rather than strength and vitality. This critique was both deeply personal and philosophical, as Nietzsche's earlier friendship with Wagner had influenced much of his thinking. Yet as Nietzsche evolved, so did his views, and by 1888, he felt compelled to attack the very man he once revered. Nietzsche followed the case of Wagner with another bold work, The Twilight of the Idols. This was a lighter, yet biting series of critiques aimed at the philosophical and religious doctrines Nietzsche opposed. The title of the work parodied Wagner's opera The Twilight of the Gods, the final part of his epic Ring cycle, which symbolized the end of the old divine order. Nietzsche, in his characteristic wit, used his title to signify his intention to demolish the idols of philosophy, religion, and morality that had dominated European thought for centuries. In the twilight of the idols, Nietzsche took aim at figures like Socrates, Plato, and the entire Christian tradition, arguing that their ideas had weakened the human spirit and stifled creativity and individuality. Continuing in this burst of productivity, Nietzsche also penned The Antichrist, a sharp and controversial critique of Christianity itself. In this work, Nietzsche examined the origins of Christianity and the figure of Jesus Christ. However, unlike the common view of Jesus as the founder of Christianity, Nietzsche presented a provocative distinction. He praised Jesus as a figure who lived free from hatred, resentment, and judgment, embodying a pure, life-affirming form of spirituality. Yet Nietzsche argued that early Christians distorted Jesus' original teachings. Instead of embracing the life-affirming message of love and freedom, early Christianity, according to Nietzsche, imposed a doctrine of judgment based on heaven and hell, a system of rewards and punishments that ultimately served to control the masses through fear. Nietzsche contrasted Jesus' teachings with those of Buddhism, remarking on the differences between the two religions. He admired Buddhism for making no promises it could not keep, focusing on tangible spiritual practices without false hope. Christianity, on the other hand, Nietzsche claimed, promised everything, eternal life, divine justice, but failed to deliver on its promises. For Nietzsche, this was the heart of Christianity's failure. He saw it as a religion built on deception, offering illusory rewards to pacify the masses and prevent them from seeking true freedom and self-overcoming. In September 1888, Nietzsche returned to Turin, where his creative output continued unabated. As he approached his 44th birthday on October 15, 1888, Nietzsche decided to mark the occasion with a new, highly personal project, an autobiographical work titled Ecce Homo. The title, Latin for Behold the Man, was a reference to the words spoken by Pontius Pilate as he presented Jesus to the crowd before his crucifixion. Nietzsche's choice of title was provocative, as it suggested a parallel between himself and Christ, but also between the reception of his ideas and the fate of misunderstood figures throughout history. In Ecce Homo, Nietzsche sought to clear up the many misunderstandings that had arisen about his work over the years. He felt that his readers, and perhaps the world at large, had failed to grasp the true essence of his philosophy. The book was structured around chapters with provocative titles such as Why I Am So Wise, Why I Am So Clever, and Why I Write Such Good Books. Far from being mere self-aggrandizement, these titles reflected Nietzsche's ironic and self-reflective tone. He used them to explore the various influences on his life and thought, from his troubled upbringing to his struggles with illness, as well as the philosophers, artists, and musicians who had shaped his intellectual journey, both positively and negatively. Ecce Homo was Nietzsche's attempt to present his life and work on his own terms, free from the distortions of his critics and the misunderstandings of his readers. It was a work that mixed humor, philosophy, and autobiography, offering a rare glimpse into the mind of one of the most original thinkers of his time. Yet, tragically, Ecce Homo would be among the last works Nietzsche would complete before the onset of his final mental collapse in early 1889. In Ecce Homo, Nietzsche's final completed work, he unleashed both his humor and his philosophical insights with provocative flair. While defending his own writings, Nietzsche filled the text with deliberate exaggerations, claiming that his masterpiece, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, surpassed the works of literary giants such as Goethe, Shakespeare, and Dante. These boasts were not meant to be taken literally, but rather as part of Nietzsche's unique style of self-presentation, a mixture of irony, wit, and sharp criticism. The sarcastic chapter titles, such as Why I Am So Wise and Why I Write Such Good Books, served to poke fun at his own image as a philosopher and writer. Nietzsche's humor, however, was not always understood by his audience, and some critics took his boasts at face value. But for those familiar with his style, Ecce Homo was filled with tongue-in-cheek remarks, reflections on his life, and deep insights into his philosophical journey. It was also a deeply personal work, one in which Nietzsche revisited the split between himself and his former idol, Richard Wagner, a rupture that still troubled him many years after it occurred. Nietzsche compiled extracts from his previous writings to argue that it was Wagner, not he, who had changed over time. In Nietzsche's view, Wagner had increasingly embraced nationalism and catered to the popular sentiments of the day, especially through his alignment with the rising tide of German nationalism. Nietzsche, who had once viewed Wagner as a revolutionary artist, was deeply disappointed by this shift. He saw it as a betrayal of the higher ideals they once shared. The bitterness over this schism lingered in Nietzsche's heart, even as he continued to denounce Wagner's artistic and cultural choices. Unfortunately, Nietzsche's burst of creativity and philosophical output in the 1880s was soon overshadowed by a rapid deterioration in his mental health. By the end of 1888, signs of his declining state became more apparent. Nietzsche started experiencing fits of anger and grandiose delusions, sending bizarre letters to prominent figures such as Kaiser Wilhelm II and Otto von Bismarck, denouncing their political doctrines. In one particularly unhinged letter to a friend, he spoke of forming an anti-German league to overthrow the German Empire, a clear manifestation of his growing detachment from reality. On January 3, 1889, Nietzsche wrote a letter to his friend Meta von Salis in which he declared, "God is on earth," and claimed that he had imprisoned the Pope, as well as ordering the executions of Kaiser Wilhelm and Bismarck. These delusional proclamations were symptomatic of his increasingly fragile mental state. The event that would become infamous in accounts of Nietzsche's final breakdown occurred in the streets of Turin. According to reports, Nietzsche witnessed a horse being brutally flogged by its owner. Moved by compassion and perhaps overwhelmed by the intensity of the scene, Nietzsche ran to protect the horse, throwing his arms around its neck before collapsing in tears at its feet. This episode, often referred to as Nietzsche's horse incident, marked the public revelation of his mental collapse. From this point forward, it became clear that his condition had deteriorated to an irreparable degree. The precise cause of Nietzsche's mental breakdown remains the subject of debate. Some historians argue that he was suffering from syphilis, contracted in his youth, which may have advanced to neurosyphilis by the late 1880s. Others have speculated that a brain tumor or some other neurological condition may have been responsible for his increasingly erratic behavior. Whatever the underlying cause, Nietzsche's mental health had worsened significantly between 1888 and 1889, leaving him unable to continue his work. As word of Nietzsche's erratic behavior spread, his family quickly took action. His sister Elizabeth, who had always been close to him despite their differences, hurried to have him brought back to Switzerland. After a series of medical examinations, doctors concluded that Nietzsche may indeed have been suffering from syphilis, leading to his mental decline. In the spring of 1889, Nietzsche was transferred to the care of his mother, Franziska, in their family home in Naumburg. During the early years of his confinement, Nietzsche could still manage to speak in brief, coherent sentences during conversations. But as time passed, his condition worsened, and he gradually lost the ability to communicate in any meaningful way. His once sharp intellect, which had produced some of the most profound works in Western philosophy, was now tragically silenced. The fate of Nietzsche's unpublished works hung in the balance after his collapse. His sister Elizabeth, having returned from a failed colonization experiment in Paraguay that ended with the suicide of her husband, took it upon herself to safeguard her brother's legacy. In 1892, she granted the publisher Naumann the rights to produce a second edition of Nietzsche's complete works, to be edited by Heinrich Koselitz, who had been Nietzsche's friend and trusted collaborator for many years. Koselleck, who went by the pseudonym Peter Gast, was responsible for much of the editorial work on Nietzsche's later writings. However, by 1893, Elizabeth began to assert greater control over the process of managing her brother's intellectual estate. She sidelined Koselleck and took charge of Nietzsche's literary legacy herself, even going so far as to write a biography of her brother. In this work, Elizabeth resumed her long-standing feud with Lou Andrea Salomé, the woman Nietzsche had once loved and who Elizabeth blamed, in part, for his psychological collapse. Elizabeth's biography painted a highly selective and often misleading picture of her brother's life, casting herself as the devoted sister who sought to preserve the truth of Nietzsche's genius while blaming others for his downfall. By 1895, Elizabeth had come into conflict with her own mother, Franziska, over the rights to Nietzsche's works and their future royalties. After a heated argument, Elizabeth bought out her mother's share of the royalties, taking full control of her brother's intellectual estate. When Franziska died in April 1897, Elizabeth moved Nietzsche to the Villa Silberblick, near Weimar, where she continued to manage his affairs. At the Villa Silberblick, Elizabeth created a kind of shrine to her brother, receiving admirers of Nietzsche's works and philosophy, even though Nietzsche himself was no longer capable of engaging with them. Visitors were sometimes brought to see the ailing philosopher, though by this time, he was a shadow of his former self, lost in a world of mental darkness from which he would never emerge. On the 25th of August, 1900, Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche passed away at Villa Silberblick after suffering a heart attack just a few months shy of his 56th birthday. His death marked the end of a tumultuous life filled with struggles against debilitating illness and mental anguish. 3 days later, Nietzsche was laid to rest beside his father at the parish church in Rocken, his birthplace, despite protests from the local vicar. The irony of the situation was striking. Nietzsche, the relentless critic of Christianity and traditional morality, found his final resting place in a Christian graveyard, the very institution he had sought to dismantle in much of his work. Nietzsche's life had been a complex journey. He began his career as a respected academic, only to turn into one of the most original and radical thinkers of his time. His intellectual evolution was marked by a fierce rejection of conventional morality and Christianity, which he believed stifled the human spirit. Yet, in a twist of fate, Nietzsche would be buried in the very soil of the faith he had spent much of his life opposing. The irony surrounding Nietzsche's life did not end with his burial. Just as he had once argued that the followers of Jesus distorted his teachings after his death, Nietzsche's own philosophy was similarly misrepresented after his demise. Various political ideologies seized upon his ideas, bending them to their own ends. Imperialists, communists, and fascists alike found in Nietzsche's concepts of the will to power, master morality, and the Übermensch, Superman, useful tools for their respective agendas. Yet, in many cases, they fundamentally misunderstood or misused his work. Perhaps the worst culprit of this misrepresentation was Nietzsche's own sister, Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche. After her brother's death, Elizabeth took control of his literary estate, and through selective editing and deliberate distortions, she presented Nietzsche as a German nationalist and anti-Semite, views he never held. Her actions contributed significantly to the later appropriation of Nietzsche's philosophy by the Nazis, who saw in him a forerunner of their ideology. Elizabeth even cultivated relationships with prominent members of the Nazi Party, including Adolf Hitler himself, whom she met on several occasions before her death in 1935. Hitler, eager to align the Nazi regime with Nietzsche's reputation as a revolutionary thinker, visited Villa Silberblick and posed for photographs with Elizabeth beside a bust of Nietzsche. The philosopher who had railed against authoritarianism, nationalism, and the herd mentality of the masses was now posthumously co-opted into one of the most brutal and authoritarian regimes in history. It was not just Nietzsche's philosophy that was exploited by the Nazis. His former idol, Richard Wagner, and Wagner's works were similarly hijacked by Hitler and his inner circle to serve the regime's nationalist and racist agenda. Both Wagner and Nietzsche, whose work had diverged so sharply from each other in life, found themselves entwined again in death, their ideas twisted to justify the horrors of the Nazi regime. In the broader scope of intellectual history, few philosophers have left behind a legacy as contentious as Friedrich Nietzsche. On one hand, he is rightly celebrated as one of the most original and revolutionary thinkers of modern times. Whether one agrees with his conclusions or not, Nietzsche's works, such as The Birth of Tragedy, Beyond Good and Evil, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and his essays and Untimely Meditations, present deeply novel and provocative arguments. His philosophy challenged centuries-old assumptions about morality, religion, and society, shaking the foundations of Western thought. Yet, many have found his radical rejection of social egalitarianism and his critique of Western morality deeply troubling. Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, for example, has been frequently misinterpreted as advocating for a kind of superiority over others, when in reality, it was a call for self-overcoming and the creation of new values beyond the constraints of traditional morality. While Nietzsche's work contains sharp criticisms of democracy, socialism, and the Christian ethic of humility and compassion, it is important to recognize that he was not a fascist, nor did he advocate for fascist ideals. In fact, attributing fascist views to Nietzsche is a distortion of his philosophy. Nietzsche was a fierce critic of nationalism and anti-Semitism, both of which became central tenets of fascist ideology. His writings often emphasize individual freedom, the dangers of mass movements, and the need to break away from the herd mentality that dominates so much of human life. The appropriation of Nietzsche by the Nazis was a gross misrepresentation, enabled in large part by the actions of his sister Elizabeth, who reshaped his image to suit her own agenda. Despite the many controversies surrounding his work, Nietzsche's influence is undeniable. His critiques of morality, religion, and culture have left an indelible mark on Western thought, particularly in the fields of existentialism and postmodernism. His declaration of the death of God foreshadowed the rise of secularism and the decline of the Christian churches in 20th century Europe. Nietzsche's exploration of nihilism, the existential crisis that follows the collapse of traditional values, laid the groundwork for much of the existential philosophy that emerged in the post-war period, influencing thinkers such as Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, and Martin Heidegger. Nietzsche's writings continue to provoke debate, inspire new interpretations, and challenge readers to question their most deeply held beliefs. Whether one agrees with his conclusions or not, there is no denying the power and originality of his thought. He remains, more than a century after his death, one of the most influential and misunderstood philosophers in history. Many of Nietzsche's arguments concerning the evolution of society have, over time, permeated various academic disciplines, including history, anthropology, and sociology. His critique of morality, culture, and human progress continues to be explored, debated, and reinterpreted by scholars in these fields. Whether through his commentary on the shifting tides of societal values or his prophetic insights into the decline of religion and the rise of secularism, Nietzsche's ideas have transcended the boundaries of philosophy and influenced an astonishing range of intellectual disciplines. Perhaps the most striking feature of Nietzsche's work is the sheer breadth of his intellectual pursuits. While primarily known as a philosopher, his writings extend far beyond the realm of traditional philosophical inquiry. Nietzsche delved into history, anthropology, and philology with the same vigor he applied to his critiques of morality and culture. He examined religion not merely as a theological concept, but as a socio-cultural phenomenon that shaped and constrained human development. His work on literary and artistic criticism was equally profound, offering insights into the nature of creativity and the role of art in the human experience. Moreover, Nietzsche's engagement with musical theory, especially his reflections on the works of Wagner, demonstrated his deep appreciation for the transformative power of art and music in shaping cultural values. Nietzsche's ability to weave together such diverse fields of study into a cohesive critique of modernity is one of the reasons why his work remains so influential and provocative. His intellectual reach was vast, and his willingness to challenge conventional thinking in multiple domains has ensured that, whether one loves or loathes him, Nietzsche cannot be ignored in modern scholarship. His concepts and ideas have left an indelible mark on not only philosophy, but also on the way we understand history, culture, and society. In the end, what is one to make of Friedrich Nietzsche? Was he, as many believe, a profound and original thinker who dared humanity to seek improvement, to strive for new heights of cultural and intellectual achievement? Or was he, as some suggest, the product of a tortured mind, a thinker whose complex and often paradoxical philosophy reflected the inner turmoil he experienced in the 1880s as his mental health deteriorated? These questions continue to divide scholars and readers alike. For some, Nietzsche's critique of conventional morality and his vision of the Übermensch represent an empowering call to overcome mediocrity and embrace a life of creative self-realization. For others, his rejection of egalitarianism and his disdain for traditional values are seen as troubling or even dangerous, fostering a philosophy that seems indifferent to human suffering. Yet, regardless of whether one finds Nietzsche's philosophy inspiring or unsettling, there is no doubt that his ideas have left an enduring legacy. His work continues to challenge us to question our assumptions about morality, power, and human potential. In a world where societal norms are constantly evolving, Nietzsche's exploration of the tensions between individual freedom, cultural values, and societal structures remains as relevant today as it was in his own time. So, what do you think of Friedrich Nietzsche? Was he a profound and original thinker who encouraged humanity to seek improvement and scale new heights of cultural and intellectual achievement? Or was his complex philosophy the product of a mind in decline during the later years of his life? We would love to hear your thoughts, so please share your opinions in the comment section below. Thank you very much for watching.